Welcome to the first lecture on cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process by which we take food and we make ATP. And we've already talked about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which you should be able to draw, of course. You have a sugar, which I'm going to draw horribly here. And you have adenosine, which is a purine, so it's 2 rings, and then you have phosphate groups attached over here, and you have 3 of them. And when one of those phosphate groups breaks off, energy is released, and that's what powers most of cellular work. And we've talked about the idea that light flows in, energy comes into the ecosystem as light and leaves as heat. And in between, it's captured by organelles known as chloroplasts, and those generate sugars and other organic molecules and oxygen gas, which are also inputs to the mitochondria, which make ATP. And then mitochondria poop out carbon dioxide and water vapor, which are also inputs for chloroplasts. So we're going to talk in this chapter mostly about the bottom side of this equation. And then in the next chapter, we'll talk about photosynthesis, how organic molecules are made by plants. And we'll go from there. So, mitochondrion, that's singular for this organelle. This is a really cool organelle. It's an organelle that actually has its own ring of DNA. It has a nucleoid in it, like bacteria have. And in fact, we believe that mitochondria are evolved from bacteria. They are an organelle derived from bacteria. They have their own nucleoid, and they have their own ribosomes that are more similar to ribosomes of bacteria than to the rest of the ribosomes in your cell. And if we were to draw one of these things, we would start by drawing kind of a bean shape. And then so this is our outer membrane, and then there's an inner membrane, and that inner membrane is really folded up. Okay? So this is our outer membrane. Remember, this is an organelle, right? And this is our inner membrane. This area right here, this area right in here, this space, like it's all throughout here, but I'm just going to draw, from here to here, inside here. This is the intermembrane space. Intermembrane space. This area inside the inner membrane is called the matrix. And these folds in the membrane are called cristae. Cristae. It made that weird line again, but these folds like these here. These folds add lots of surface area because it's important to have lots of folds because you have a lot of enzymes and things embedded in these membranes, and you can fit more enzymes in here if there are folds in that membrane. Other things you would have inside here would be a nucleoid of DNA, and you would have ribosomes. This is basically like a bacteria that lives inside of your cells. Okay, now the process described in this chapter is cellular respiration, and cellular respiration occurs in both heterotrophs and autotrophs. Autotrophs, troph refers to feeding, and auto means self-feeding. These are photosynthesizers. This means they make sugar or make foods. We're going to follow glucose in these chapters, so we focus on sugar. Heterotrophs eat others for food. But both do respiration. So do plants undergo respiration? Yes, they absolutely do. They don't make sugar to be nice. They make it so their mitochondria can use it to make ATP. Okay, so heterotrophs eat others for food. Autotrophs make their own food. Now, in all of these reactions that we're going to talk about, the primary kind of reaction we're looking at in photosynthesis and respiration are known as redox reactions, which are reactions that transfer electrons and energy from one molecule to another. Okay, so let me show you an example of this. Here we have molecule A and molecule B. Molecule A has its electrons shown here. Electrons have a negative charge, okay? And there's 2 electrons that they're showing here. If molecule A loses its electrons, or more, you might think of it as they're stolen. If your electrons are taken from you, you become oxidized, or you have been oxidized. If you gain electrons, you have been reduced. Okay? So compound B here is the oxidizer, or oxidizing agent. It steals electrons. Oxidizing agents or oxidizers steal electrons. A real common oxidizer in the world is oxygen. Okay, oxygen steals electrons. Like if this were, oops, let me step back. If A were iron and B were oxygen, oxygen steals electrons from iron and causes it to rust, right? And because electrons are the glue that holds matter together, and so you steal electrons, you cause things to fall apart, to become oxidized. And in this case, oxygen would have grabbed those electrons. Oxygen really likes electrons, and it can grab a hold of them really well. So if we look at a molecule here that's very common in biology, that's glucose, which I always draw kind of like a stop sign, right? Oh, that almost worked. There's glucose. Its chemical formula is C6, so there's 6 carbons, there's 12 hydrogens, and there's 6 oxygens. C6H12O6. This is a carbohydrate, or a sugar. You react it with oxygen. So remember, oxygen is an oxidizer, or an oxidizing agent. It steals electrons. It takes electrons from this, which causes it to fall apart. Glucose falls apart without electrons. Electrons are the glue that holds matter together. And you reduce oxygen, so oxygen becomes reduced. Why do we use this word reduced? Reduced means you've reduced its charge, because remember, electrons have a negative charge. So if you add electrons to something, you are reducing its charge because electrons are negative. So it becomes reduced. And what does oxygen become reduced to? H2O. When you glue electrons onto things, usually hydrogen comes along for the ride. So instead of just oxygen with extra electrons, you get H2O. And glucose becomes oxidized to CO2. 6 of them. All 6 of these carbons form individual carbon dioxides now. So glucose is oxidized to carbon dioxide, and oxygen is reduced to water in this reaction, and energy is released. So this is an exergonic reaction we're talking about. Here's an example of a very famous exergonic reaction. If you've never watched the Hindenburg disaster, Google Hindenburg or just YouTube it. You'll find this video. So the Hindenburg was a Zeppelin full of hydrogen gas, H2. Okay, and when hydrogen gas reacts with oxygen, technically we should put O2 here, I think. So you add a little bit of destabilizing energy to break the bonds in H2. All right, so you add a little heat, a spark, and then suddenly hydrogen gas and oxygen gas react, forming H2O. And you would think that would just make a big old wet cloud, right? But instead, when you take oxygen and you stick it to hydrogen, what happens is electrons from the hydrogen are drawn towards the oxygen. The electrons are drawn towards the oxygen when they make that bond, and as they're pulled towards that oxygen atom, they lose energy, and that energy is released as heat, and it's an explosive reaction. So you had a hydrogen atom with a single electron here, right? And now it's stuck to an oxygen. And they're sharing these electrons. The electron and hydrogen, because oxygen really likes electrons. I'm going to give you a word here. We'll use again later. Oxygen is very electronegative, meaning this. So if you measure something's electronegativity, it's a measure of affinity for electrons. And oxygen has a very high electronegativity. It really likes to grab electrons. And so it pulls hydrogen's electrons towards itself. It doesn't steal them in this case, but it pulls them towards itself. And that causes the electrons to lose energy, and that energy is lost as heat. In this case, very explosive heat. Okay, so aerobic respiration is kind of like the same thing we saw with the Hindenburg there. It's sugar in this case, glucose, plus 6 oxygens, and that's going to yield carbon dioxide and water. When this happens, it's a delta G of 686 kilocal per mole of glucose, and of course that would be a negative 686 because it's a loss of energy. It's an exergonic reaction. And we don't want that to happen all at once in our bodies. If we released all the energy in glucose at once, we'd explode like the Hindenburg. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to divide it up into lots of steps and release little bits of energy at a time, like going down a set of stairs. If you're at the top of a skyscraper, if this is you up here, and you jump off and you splatter at the bottom, you've released all your energy, all your potential energy at once, and you went at the bottom. If you instead you come down the stairs a little at a time, at the bottom you're okay, and you've released the exact amount of energy as you did if you had fallen off, but you did it over many small steps, and so you didn't experience catastrophic failure by impacting the ground all at once. And that's what cellular respiration is going to do. So in the next video, we're going to talk about what some of those steps are that allow us to extract energy from food in steps rather than resulting in us detonating after every meal.